What's so great about We Have Always Lived in the Castle? Shirley Jackson's claws are in everything Gothic today. Much in the same way that she was likely inspired by the Brontes and more supernatural Gothic like Dracula and Frankenstein, these days so much modern Gothic literature is inspired by Shirley Jackson and Daphne du Maurier. The last two video reviews that I did were one British novel and one short story collection, both of which were so Shirley Jackson-esque. And so I'm asking the question, what's so great about We Have Always Lived in the Castle? At the very top of this edition of this book, Donna Tartt, author of The Secret History, said that this is her greatest book. I haven't read everything that Shirley Jackson has written, so I can't say that, I can't agree or disagree, but it really is an incredible piece of modern Gothic literature. Is modern the right word? Contemporary? 20th century Gothic literature. So what's it about? We Have Always Lived in the Castle is set in the aftermath of a tragedy, where many members of a very isolated family in a small town in rural New England have died, and the ones who are left are kind of just living this hollow existence in their home. Our three main protagonists are comprised of two young girls, sisters, who live in this house. One of them is in her late 20s, the other in her late teens, and they're very, very close. They also have an uncle, Uncle Julian, who lives with them and is in a wheelchair, his mind is going, and he is constantly obsessed with writing his memoirs. He's obsessed with the past, and he's obsessed with the tragedy that led us to where we are today. The eldest sister, Constance, was put on trial for having killed the rest of the family. It is well established, it was proven, that the family was poisoned at dinner. Arsenic was found in the sugar bowl, and Constance was the one that everyone suspected. She didn't eat the sugar that night, and so it makes sense that she put it in there. Her younger sister, Merrycat, who is our eyes and ears in the book, she wasn't there at dinner. She had been sent up to her room because she'd done something bad, and she was also very, very young. She was only about 12 years old at the time. It's been 6 years since then, and now Merrycat is 18. Constance has been acquitted. There was no proof that she did the crime, and so the family just carries on. And this is where we begin the book. Quite unusually, the first two chapters of this book are arguably my favourite chapters. We Have Always Lived in the Castle is very much separated into three distinct acts, kind of like a play, which I really, really enjoyed. The first act establishes them. It gets the backstory that I've just told you. It gives us a really good feel for not only these three characters, but also the house that they live in and the town that the house sits at the edge of. In many ways, they are a Dracula kind of family. They exist on the fringes of their small society, and people live in fear, people hate them, people make comments and threats. It is a very Dracula setup. And then in Act 2, we are introduced to their cousin, Charles. Charles is Uncle Julian's brother's kid. He's in his early 30s, a little bit older than Constance, and he has just come along. He has pushed himself into their home very, very suddenly. And I won't tell you much about him, and I won't touch Act 3. Act 3 is insane in terms of its events. Act 2 is very much a hostile family drama, and Act 1 is this creepy gothic setting of the scene. And I really liked Act 1 in particular. I think I really liked that the way the scene was set up. I really like Merrycat and her introduction. I love her as a protagonist and a narrator. I think she is so well written as this robotic, emotionless, almost sinister, innocent but maybe not innocent young girl. She describes things in such a strange, matter-of-fact way with hyper amounts of detail. She really feels like a robot in many ways. And at the beginning of the book, she goes into town. She goes into town twice a week to collect groceries and library books. And while she's in town, she goes into this local cafe diner and she talks briefly to the woman who runs the diner, gets some coffee, and then she is passive-aggressively taunted and bullied by two men who come in. And this scene absolutely captivated me. I didn't blink the entire time I was reading it. I loved this scene in particular because it sets up Merrycat. It sets up the fear that all of the townsfolk have, particularly of Constance, who is never there. Constance never leaves the house anymore. Not in the last 6 years at least. And it sets up the general relationship of the townsfolk to each other as a kind of mob and to the house. So again, this is a very Dracula-esque setup. And again, you can see that with the cover and the title, We Have Always Lived in the Castle. It really makes you feel like they are vampires. They have always lived in the castle. And perhaps there's something in here to be examined about things like the class system, the fact that they live in such a big house on an endless sweep of farmland, and their mother came from another big rich family of the same area. So they are inheriting wealth and hoarding their wealth as well. So there's something here about class. There's something here about proletariat versus bourgeoisie. But I don't think I'm actually clever enough to examine that, so I'm not going to. But I'd be interested to read some essays or watch a documentary or something on that topic if it's been covered. I'll Google it later, because I'm very interested in that perspective. Anyway, that setup really, really captured me. And from there, we get introduced to Constance and Uncle Julian. Uncle Julian is the one that pretty much establishes to us, the reader, what happened and what led them there. The fact that the family died, the fact that Constance was put on trial for it and acquitted, and the fact that they are now such isolated and strange people. All three of them are very strange. It's interesting that Constance is 10 years older than Merricat, and yet she is far more innocent, juvenile, and Merricat kind of feels the need to step up and look after her big sister. Their roles are entirely reversed. And that in itself is a little bit creepy and strange. And then Uncle Julian is pretty much useless because his mind is going, his body is going, and he cycles through these thoughts over and over about writing his journals. And it's this obsession with his journals that keeps the past alive because he keeps talking about it so much. I've also repeatedly referenced Frankenstein and Dracula, and this is very much supernatural Gothic without the supernatural. Merricat is kind of a witch. She uses these totems, talismans, charms, whatever you want to call them. She creates talismans out of things that she owns and magic words as well. She selects magic words, and as long as those words aren't uttered, so she tries to pick really obscure words that don't come up in conversation, she uses them to protect the land of their home and the people in it. She also puts these totems and talismans around the house, around the grounds. She buries things. She's obsessed with burying things. She nails a book to a tree, and that book totem is supposed to keep them all safe. There's superstition here. She is a very, very superstitious young woman. She is paranoid, and that's at the crux and the heart of this book, is paranoia, superstition, fear. The townsfolk are afraid of them, and their fear comes out in hatred and anger and disgust. And they are afraid of the outside world. They are afraid of many different things. People, places, invaders, intruders, change to their status quo, to their situation. They're afraid of almost everything. And so there is a real witchcrafty witchiness going on here. Everything about this is Gothic in terms of its isolated setting, its paranoid characters. There is an eerie stillness in the air. It's claustrophobic. It harks back to the supernatural styles of the Gothic without actually being supernatural. In many ways, it reminds me of the film The Witch, which I've mentioned so many times in videos because it's one of my favorite films. But I love how in that film, there's no real evidence of anything supernatural going on. Again, it's an isolated community, a small family, they're paranoid, they're afraid, they're superstitious, and then you wonder if the supernatural will factor in at any point. Kind of the same thing here. It's a truly Gothic premise and theme that you have seen repeatedly, but Shirley Jackson does it better than probably anyone. There's a reason why so many modern Gothic stories feel Shirley Jackson-esque. It's because of this book. It's also really nice and short, 150 pages, 3 acts, 50 pages each. It has a really nice rhythm to it. And I like that rhythm because this book could stagnate. Given that it has an isolated location and a small cast of characters, all of which are very odd in their own way, and lack emotion, it could easily stagnate and become boring. It avoids that by having this 3-act structure, by introducing Cousin Charles, who is a much more ordinary person in the way that he talks. He's sociable, he has emotions, he gets angry very easily, he demonstrates enthusiasm and excitement. He's not to be trusted, and they don't trust him, and I'm not going to talk about that. But he is still human. It's kind of more so than they are in many ways, and I really enjoyed that because it keeps everything fresh. This book transforms from act to act, from setup to intimate and tense drama to just going batshit insane at the end. And that allows it to avoid being boring at any single moment, and also the fact that it's short, and the fact that Shirley Jackson writes with such deft detail in a creepy kind of way. I think a lot of the suspense doesn't come from the events or the fear or the paranoia that's set up. A lot of it is simply the way that Shirley Jackson sets her scenes. The way that she writes through Merricat, the eyes that we see through are filled with superstition and paranoia. And she writes with such detail. Merricat has obsessions, and she's constantly analysing things and looking at things and watching out for things, making sure that things are in the right place. She's kind of a chess player, a puppet master, always keeping an eye on everything, and so you feel hyper-aware as you read it in the same way that she does, playing out the story. She is such a fun character to see through the eyes of. And I became very, very attached to her. She feels like a true Gothic heroine. She's our Heathcliff. She's our Victor Frankenstein. In the same way that those two are fascinating protagonists and not nice people at all, Merricat fills that void in the same way in the modern Gothic, if you like. She has become the face of the modern Gothic, and I think she is such a charming character. But again, in no way is she nice. None of them are nice. There are no good people. There are never good people in Gothic literature. There are no heroes. There are only really villains. And again, that's one of my favourite things about the Gothic. Because Gothic stories are innately ridiculous and hyperbolized and camp, there is always a sense of the comedy. There is something comedic about this. It is sometimes tongue-in-cheek. Shirley Jackson herself lived a very similar kind of a life in isolation, paranoid about the outside world. At least that's what I got from the film Shirley, which is really great. And so you can see that she's almost poking fun at herself and her world here, and I really enjoyed that. It's not without its comedy. If there are moments where you feel like this is ridiculous and you want to laugh, it was probably intentional. And that, again, helps add layers of intrigue and interest and entertainment to the story. By the way, I have watched the film adaptation of this, starring Vera Farmiga's little sister and that guy from the Marvel films. It came out like 2 years ago, and it is fantastic. If you haven't watched it, I cannot recommend it enough. It captures the characters, the setting, the tone, it follows all the story beats. It's a perfect film adaptation. More and more as time goes on, as a film fan and a literature fan, I'm more and more fascinated by film adaptations and how you adapt things to film. In the same way that a good song cover should be original, a film adaptation should add some originality, otherwise what's the point? And this film doesn't really add much originality, it's such a faithful adaptation. But that doesn't bother me in the way that it should, and I find that quite fascinating. I'll have to watch it again and see what it is about that film being such a faithful adaptation that doesn't bore me and made me grateful to have seen it and think that it's a really great film. Anyway, check it out. It's really good. I have a lot more thoughts about this book, and I could keep talking, and I just don't want to because we'll be here all day. It's a really great book. We Have Always Lived in the Castle is exactly as good as people say it is. Good book. Read it if you haven't. Subscribe for books. Actually, before you go, I could really do with some more support on Patreon. You can join my Patreon for $3 a month, and I would appreciate every single extra bit of help that I can get. The more money I have, the more support I get from Patreon, the more videos I can put out, and the more money I can put into my videos as well. I really want some lighting equipment. Subscribe for books.